But what motivated me to do this video is that there was a welterweight discussion going on at the Lion's Den. It was a top 10 discussion, and Barbados Joe Walcott was pushed out of the top 10. Now, when ranking welterweights, I've always ranked Barbados Joe Walcott in the top 10. But these discussions, they're very necessary because they make you think, why do I have him in the top 10? Now, I basically had Barbados Joe in the top 10 based on the time period he fought in, the era. I knew that he fought some tough fighters, but I didn't know a whole lot about Barbados Joe Walcott. I know a little bit more about Jersey Joe Walcott. Now, let's not get them confused. Jersey Joe Walcott, his original name is Arnold Raymond Cream. He changed his name to Jersey Joe to honor Barbados Joe Walcott because of the things that this man had done. The great things that this fighter accomplished have been passed down from generation to generation. Therefore, this inspired Arnold Raymond Cream to change his ring name to Joe Walcott, Jersey Joe Walcott. I'm going to make this as short as possible because I came up on so much information during that time period. But I really wanted to look into it deeper. I wanted to know who he fought. I wanted to know what was different then and compared to what we have now in regards to the rules, the politics. Let me tell you, this time period when Barbados Joe Walcott fought, we're not talking about Jersey Joe Walcott. Don't get them confused. Jersey Joe Walcott is over 50 years later. We're talking Barbados Joe, the original Joe Walcott. First of all, he was known as the Barbados Demon. Some people call him Black Dynamite. He fought from 1890 to 1911. So he had a 21-year career. And no, this ain't the 20-year career that the fighters today have with big gloves, short rounds, getting to pick who they want to fight. This ain't this time period. This time period here is the sports entertainment era. The time period before this one, the one that I could remember from the 1970s to the 1990s, I don't really consider those guys strictly sports entertainment like this era of today. Now, there are some throwback fighters today. There are some fighters who are probably cut from the cloth of the fighters from back in this time period. But we have to remember that times have changed since then. But this man's name continued to get passed down from generation to generation as a warrior. I'm talking about a guy who was before even TV. Fuck social media and the internet. I'm talking about before TV. This man's name would be remembered off of newspaper clippings, basically, and word of mouth, to the point to where it would inspire another great fighter to change his ring name to Jersey Joe. As a youngster, Barbados Joe Walcott, coming from out of Barbados, eventually moved to Boston. He got a job on the boats and shit, on the docks, and he moved out to Boston, okay? It was here where he got a job in the gym. He got a job in a local boxing gym. They found out, hey, this is one tough son of a gun here. He was only 5'1", 140 pounds around. He never fought over the weight of 148. So he's been pretty much a welterweight his whole career. But he was already recognized as the best welterweight in the world before he even won the title. They didn't want to fight him. But one thing that I found out about this era is that black fighters did get shots depending on who they was affiliated with. There's this myth that white fighters from that time period didn't fight black fighters, but come to find out, I did some research on some of the guys that Walcott fought, and come to find out they fought all the top prominent black fighters of that time. Well, let me put it this way. Some fought more than others, but a large majority of these fighters fought all kind of black fighters, which I'm going to show you in my research. In fact, they fought more black fighters than the fighters that you guys are ranking ahead of them on all-time lists. So anyone who's using that excuse, well, they don't fight black fighters, I have a feeling that the guys that you're ranking ahead of this guy because he didn't fight black fighters probably didn't fight as many black fighters as the fighter, the white fighter of the past, that you're knocking off of your all-time list because of this reason. Now, I'm sure there was a few divas in the mix. And when I do extensive research on Jack Dempsey in similar fashion as the research that I did with Barbados Joe Walcott, I'll find the answers. Barbados Joe Walcott, an amazing fighter, man. Yes, he had over 20 losses, but this guy had plenty of things going against him. Number one, this guy didn't even fight very many lightweights in his career. This guy was fighting heavyweights. I'm talking ranked heavyweights too. I'm talking top-notch heavyweights. He was also the victim of the times, just being a black fighter during this time period. He had to throw some fights. It is obvious that he threw some fights when I went back and researched newspaper clippings and I researched outcomes and testimonies, okay, of the time period. And let me tell you something. This talk about fighters being cab drivers and all of that, that applies later, but it does not apply to the post-slavery era, the Reconstruction era, going on into the early 1900s. There was no cab drivers back then. I did some research and I found out that most of the fighters were dedicated to the trade at that time period. They had all kind of gyms going up, schools, former slaves who were teaching people how to fight. They was teaching people to improve their skill set in the form of fistic arts. I ran across some of these teachers while doing my research and I was fascinated by them. Guys who dedicated their whole life was working on technique shit the majority of the whole day. They didn't have other jobs. I ended up finding out that a lot of these fighters ended up taking on jobs mostly after World War I, okay? It was during this time period that there was a lot of cities that were being built and we had a lot of construction going on. They took jobs in construction and a variety of other jobs, but this did not occur during Walcott's time period. In fact, Walcott's time period was probably, man, out of all the periods that I ever researched, this was the era when fighters spent more time at their craft than any other era that I studied, including today. Today they're doing other shit. They're running around and they're not dedicated and, you know, going on social media talking about how great they are and how they're better than the fighters from this time period, which is a bunch of bullshit because the fighters from that era were real fucking warriors. The fighters from this era are sports entertainment at best. Yes, I'm going to get into the nitty gritty here. I'm going to get into the meat of Walcott's career. I'm going to back it up. I'm going to do the research and present the research for everybody out there who refuses to do research. Just come back and look at my video, and then when you're having a legacy argument or debate, you can refer to my video, which is a lot of factual information, but I must admit, a lot of the information was scattered. Sometimes I had to find information in two different sources, and sometimes I had different outcomes. Even on fights on record, there were different outcomes in some of the fights on different sites. But some of it I was able to confirm through finding old newspaper articles, which they have those clippings online. They are available. Type in any of these names that I'm talking about, and the newspaper clippings are available. They're there for anybody to see and do research on, so you could go back and you could do your own research on top of this video and come up with even more artillery or more reasons to dispute why I feel fighters from this era do not deserve to be put in the same all-time rankings as fighters from the era of today and even the 90s and 80s and 70s. The era that Walcott fought in, that's a whole different fucking can of worms, man. Walcott could not find welterweights to fight him. So what did Walcott do? He wanted to challenge the heavyweights. He wanted to challenge the light heavyweights, middleweights. He issued public challenges to Tom Sharkey, Gus Rulin, and even the champion Jim Jeffries. All of these guys declined to meet him because they had somewhat been involved with him through sparring partners, or some of them had even sparred him. which therefore led them to believe that they're taking a big risk by fighting this 5'1" lightweight who weighed 140 pounds because they knew he was very capable of putting them on their ass, even at 140. Do I believe that any of these guys today are capable at 140 to move up and fight ranked heavyweights? And I'm talking heavyweights today who are not even as skilled as the heavyweights from back then. People are always saying the heavyweights from back then were small, but I did some research. These guys was weighing over 200 pounds. Walcott, yes, little ass Walcott fought guys who were good fighters who worked on their craft every day as a heavyweight. Fighters who fought Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson and Walcott fought several of the same opponents. That's the equivalent of taking a 140-pound fighter today, now they have junior welterweight, which Walcott could have fit into the junior welterweight division today. So that's like taking Danny Garcia and putting him in there against some of the top 10 heavyweights who are not even as dedicated to their art as the heavyweights of back then. Do you think Danny Garcia or Adrian Broner can move up the heavyweight with 6-ounce gloves and fight fucking heavyweights of today with 6-ounce gloves and to fight, long rounds? No, they can't. They'll get their fucking head knocked off. But Walcott was able to do it, though. There is no way that this man cannot be ranked as a top welterweight. He is, in my opinion, a top 5 welterweight. Easy. Easy. I knew that just based off of the time period. I didn't know the information I know now. I gotta say, I didn't know it. But let me get into it a little bit here. First of all, at 5'1", Walcott was the guy who coined the frame, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. That was his phrase. He coined that phrase. He was the creative mind behind that phrase because the bigger they are, the harder they was falling when he was knocking heavyweights out because welterweights did not want to fight him. They gave Bob Fitzsimmons credit for that. Of course, he made it popular, but that's something he stole from Walcott. Walcott fought all kind of guys who fought Fitzsimmons and Jeffries. He sparred these guys. He had the same sparring partners as some of these guys. He couldn't even find sparring partners. And on top of that, here's something else that's not known. Walcott fought over 100 fights that are not even recorded. And I'm talking, this guy would get together with his manager to go make some additional money in bare knuckle fights, Kimbo Slice style, behind some bar or something. He didn't get credit for none of those fights. Do you think a fighter of today would be able to hold up to bare knuckle fighting? Not only bare knuckle fighting, but 6-ounce gloves for a 21-year period with over 100 fights off the record, with some of those being bare knuckle, but yet they want to say that they're greater than a guy who did some shit like that? I don't care what anybody says. The guys of today that are claiming they're great are not proving that they're as great as the fighters of yesterday. It's a slap in the face to say I'm greater than Walcott when I'm a cherry picker and when I get to pick the terms of my fight. They put Walcott in the situation and Walcott fought himself out of the situation and asked for more. Shit, bring me a fucking heavyweight. That was his attitude. Look at all of the fights, all the thrown fights, man. I'm surprised that this guy only has the amount of losses that he does after all the fights he had to throw. How's about the time when he fought Jim Watts? How's about that? Where he beat the shit out of Jim Watts, beating him all over the place, battering him to where Watts didn't want to get up. Watts kept falling. He didn't want to feel no more of that heat, so he kept falling. So guess what they did? They ruled it a draw because the man kept wanting to fall on the ground. How's about that? He failed at his first 2 attempts at the lightweight championship. He fought Kid Levin, one of the best fighters of this time period. Walcott was a natural welterweight, but he was drained because he wanted to get a title shot. Kid Levin was willing to fight him, but he had to make the lightweight limit. So he had to drain himself. Kid Levin won the fights, okay? Look up Kid Levin. This motherfucker is bad. He's a bad boy. Fought black fighters and all. More black fighters than the fighters of today. In 1898, he fought Mysterious Billy Smith for the welterweight title. Look up Mysterious Billy Smith. This is a bad boy from that time period. In 1900, he fought Joe Troinski. Joe Troinski, the very next year, knocked out Jack Johnson. Walcott beat him at 140 pounds, 5'1". He beat somebody who knocked out Jack Johnson. That's like one of these 140-pound fighters beating someone who knocked out a great heavyweight of their era. That's like one of these 140-pound fighters beating Nassim Rotman the year before he knocked out Lennox Lewis. Same kind of thing, even though Jack Johnson wasn't champion yet when they fought. The same kind of shit, though. It's a big accomplishment. Ain't no welterweight in y'all's top 10, the majority of them anyway, because I haven't researched some of the other ones yet. But the ones that I know about for sure, I don't think they're capable of doing that. That's just my opinion. Maybe Ray Leonard could have beat some of Larry Holmes' opponents. I don't think so, though. I doubt it. I'll tell you what I'll do. Let's go into some of Walcott's opponents here. Let's look at his opponents. Let's look at the time period. Who did he beat? Did he beat Hall of Fame fighters? Yes, he did. Did he beat world champions, former world champions, future world champions? Yes, he did. Did he beat guys who fought in the heavyweight division, light heavyweight division, middleweight division? Yes, he did. Did y'all's favorite fighters today do any of these things? No, they didn't. Not beating heavier guys, for sure. Did they fight 10 to 11 times a year? No, they didn't. Did they go into situations not knowing what was in front of them? Not knowing who they were scheduled to fight? Or they might have been scheduled to fight one person and ended up having to fight some fucking heavyweight because the person in their division got cold feet. I read several examples of this with Walcott. Several. How's about 1895, Mysterious Billy Smith, 15-round draw? Who is Billy Smith? Former welterweight champion. He fought Kid Levin, the Hall of Famer. What was Mysterious Billy Smith known for? He was known for fighting dirty. Elbows, butts, knees. And he would even bite opponents. I read that he bit Walcott in the fight. This guy was dirty. He fought black fighters, Mysterious Billy Smith. How's about the Baltimore Demon? He fought him. He fought Walcott. Walcott fought the Baltimore Demon too. That's right, Peter Jackson, the Baltimore Demon. A very good fighter from that time period who is ranked as an all-time great by many experts from that time period and on through the 1950s all the way to Burt Sugar. I looked at Billy Smith's resume very well. Come to find out, I got to about 4 or 5 fighters and he had already fought more black fighters than today's top welters, so I knew already I couldn't even say that no more. And he fought these guys with 6-ounce gloves and shit like that too. Walcott was able to get fights against the white fighters because he was affiliated with Tom O'Rourke, who was a prominent boxing manager of the time, who would get black fighters fights against white boys all the time. White guys who were willing to fight black fighters, because now that I've did the research, I don't know about the 1920s as much. I haven't got there yet, but I'm going there. Trust me. I am going to dig. But during this time period here, actually, there was a lot of white fighters who was fighting black fighters. And sometimes they didn't always want to fight the black fighter. Sometimes they had to be forced into the situation. But when you go back and you look at their resume, you end up finding out that they fought more black fighters than these fighters today, even the black ones. So I really don't want to hear that no more about how these fighters didn't fight black fighters and this and that, unless it's a specific fighter and I could go back and do the research and find out for sure, which I'm going to go into a few people's career that I've heard didn't fight black fighters. I need to look at the career. I need to do the research because I'm not too sure about that yet. How's about Kid Levin, man? Kid Levin was a bad boy, man. He actually knocked Walcott out in one of the fights. He's known as one of the best fighters of that time period. Point blank. Do your research on George Kid Levin. He fought Walcott twice. Now, one thing about Kid Levin is he was tutored by the black heavyweight Charles Smith. That's right, the Black Thunderbolt from out of Macon, Georgia. Now, hey, I'm very familiar with Macon, Georgia. And see, what happened is around that time, from like the 1860s all the way to 1900, there was a lot of black fighters that was teaching the art. They were teaching the sweet science. Charles Smith, the Black Thunderbolt, was an expert in the field of fistic arts. He trained George Levin, giving him the skill set that he needed to compete with guys like Walcott. He fought Albert Griffiths to a draw, 20 rounds. He also fought Andy Bowen. Yes, the Andy Bowen that fought the 110-round fight. But it only took Levin 18 rounds to take care of him. It was in this fight that Bowen hit his head on the unpadded ring surface, and that was it for him. He passed away. So Levin was a killer and a great fighter. Could hurt you. The only problem I have with this fight with Levin is that there was an agreement made that if Walcott, this is in the first fight, if Walcott didn't knock him out in 15 rounds, that Walcott would lose the fight regardless. Because it actually capped out at 15 rounds, okay? Sometimes the rounds went longer. Sometimes they put limits on it. If Walcott could have knocked Levin out, not only would he lose the fight, but he would have to give up his whole purse, which he had to do. The second fight with Levin, like I said, it was a knockout. But the rumor is, from several sources that I saw and testimonies from that time period and on up, that Walcott threw that second fight against Levin. The people betting money, they was highly pissed because it was just questionable how the fight ended for them. Even though they were both getting battered in the fight, Walcott was getting the better of Levin from what I read. Now, was this fight fixed? This one here was hard to determine because both fighters were battered severely. Kid Levin, though, was a smart guy, man, because not only was he affiliated with Charles Smith, but he was affiliated with George Dixon, a.k.a. Lil Chocolate. Dixon is considered the greatest fighter of the 19th century by many experts. Look him up. George Dixon. He had a school of boxing, okay? People were ready to fight back then. They knew how to fight. They weren't lazy like these motherfuckers today who are going around claiming, well, you know, people get better with time and this and that. Boxing is weight classes, man. The fighters get bigger, but it's still in the same weight class. If you was 140 now and you fight somebody like Walcott who was 140 from back then, it's the same weight. So the difference is that guys like Walcott, they spent more time on the art than the fighters of today. They were getting better trained and better schooled and better ready for their opponents in front of them. They fought under more harsh conditions. But anyways, I'm just giving you an idea of some of the guys that Walcott fought and what the atmosphere was like back then. That's all I'm trying to do here. How's about Walcott's fight against Bobby Dobbs? Bobby Dobbs was another teacher from this time period, Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction era, that was teaching people in the trade of fistic arts. That's right. A smart fighter, solid fighter of that time period. Fought some of everybody. I'm starting to find out that a lot of these guys fought each other, too. That's another thing that I've been finding out. Bobby Dobbs, he fought a lot of people that Walcott fought. Yeah, he fought Joe Gans. He fought young Peter Jackson. He also fought Walcott. You got to understand that these guys were dedicated to the art. These were not cab drivers and all of these. They were boxing all fucking day. And they went around from state to state, from country to country, and found the best fighters to fight against them. And what I'm finding out is that some of these names are recycled because no one else could beat these guys in the state. Because what they had was they had state championships. Like they have the Virginia champion. And then they'll have the champion from Pennsylvania. Then they'll have the Pacific champion and the West Coast champion. They had all kind of different champions, and then they had the one world champion. But none of these guys who were not world champions were going around calling himself world champion. There was just one world champ. How's about Tommy Warren, huh? Who he beat? A street brawler. Tommy Warren was the featherweight champion of the Pacific Coast. He was also the featherweight champion of America. In fact, he was on his way to a Hall of Fame career, but in the wild times of the late 1800s, the shoot 'em up times, he shot a man and killed him in a saloon after a bar fight, and he ended up going to prison. That was the end of his career. But this is another guy who was considered dangerous by many people. He was going around from state to state beating people's ass. He had a little bit of a wild side to him, this Tommy Warren, but he fought some of the toughest fighters from state to state to where he was the champion of America. And being the champion of America back then was not like these guys today who sit around and kind of wait and see who they could fight, who's the lowest risk and all, you know, just the shit today that's just so outrageous that makes me not even as interested in the boxing today. It's sports entertainment. I don't really call this boxing today. It's more sports entertainment. What about Fred Morris, known as Cyclone? Now, Fred Morris was the type of guy that would spoil the party. He beat some big names, man. He fought Walcott to a draw, and it is reported that they might have even fought twice. Some people give them credit for fighting twice. Some people say they don't know the outcome of the second fight. Fred Morris also fought C.A.C. Smith from out of Macon, Georgia. He fought Tommy West, Bob Armstrong. He fought Jack Bonner twice. All of these guys are guys who were dedicated to the trade. No cab drivers here. None of that shit. The shit didn't even exist back then. You were lucky to have any kind of job. If your job was fighting at that time, that was your fucking job. There weren't too many people who was taking on fighting and other shit. Once they found out you knew how to fight, they got you into training. They sent you to guys like George Dixon, Charles Smith, Bobby Dobbs. If you was a white guy, those are the kind of guys they sent you to learn how to fight. So all this shit about these guys were bums and this and that, fuck that. Do your research. I don't think any fighter from this time period could fit into that time period. Now, the fighters from that time period might not be able to come into today's time period where they have big gloves and, you know, and win a slap boxing contest against one of the prominent fighters of today. You know, it might not work out for them. But I could guarantee you fighters with their fragile hands and all of that shit could not have held up in that time period for 20 years and 21 years. These are the greatest fighters of all time. These guys here, even the opponents that they fought, should not even be ranked with these guys of today. This is a different time period. Go back and do your research. I'm sorry that I'm fucking ranting, but I'm giving good information on my fucking rant. I'm giving good information. I did my research. How's about my boy, Professor Andy Watson? Andy Watson was the teacher of teachers. He was an expert in fistic arts. He would fight anybody, anywhere, anytime. He beat some high-quality names. He fought Bobby Dobbs 5 times. He fought Billy Hill 4 times. And Billy Hill, that was a bad boy too. The Professor Andy Watson fought Sam Lankford 5 times. He even became the chief boxing instructor at Harvard in 1903. So he was a boxing instructor in Harvard. The day that he fought Andy Watson on October the 29th, the week before, when he fought Albert Kidd, Joe Log, and Fred Morris, he fought all of them on the same day. This guy had same-day fights. How's about on December 12th of 1891 when he fought 2 people in one day? Walcott fought November 4th and November 5th of 1892. November 11th and November 12th he fought. November 4th, November 5th, November 7th he fought. And these were not welterweights that he was fighting. He was fighting light heavyweights and shit. Even heavyweights with 6-ounce gloves at that. What boxer today can do something like this? He was a welterweight at the time. You want to talk about welterweight accomplishments? That is a welterweight accomplishment. He never fought past the weight of 148. And at this time, he was, early 140s, 141, 142. It ain't his fault that, welterweights ain't want to fight him. And he had to go get light heavyweights and heavyweights to spar with and had to fight the same opponents as Bob Fitzsimmons and Jack Johnson. That ain't his fault. Should he be penalized for that? How's about Bob Stonewall Allen? How's about him? Bob Stonewall Allen was one bad boy. He eventually became really good friends with Joe Walcott and Joe Gans. He also fought and lost to Belfield Walcott, the brother of Joe Walcott. He fought Sam Langford, fought him twice. See, that's the thing, man. What I started noticing going through this time period is that a lot of these fighters done fought each other. I started to notice that. I noticed a lot of these fighters was teachers. They was training other fighters and teaching them their craft. Another thing about Stonewall Allen is that this guy here, he was so tough that this man was shot 4 times in the head. He survived and then was back fighting again. Shot, gunshot, and he was a fighter. And after he recovered from his injuries to the head, he went back out there with 6-ounce gloves to fight some more. You see, that's a different breed of guy right there. People will write that off and say, well, they can't beat my favorite fighter today. Man, these guys was training all day. These guys was training all day. Under what circumstances are we talking about anyways? Are we talking about under the conditions they fought under or the conditions of today? And these fighters were lasting 20 years and shit like that. You got fighters today complaining about having hurt hands and stuff like that. How's about Tom Tracy? He fought a lot of the fighters of that time period. He fought black fighters. He challenged twice for world titles, came up short. Solid fighter. Yeah, how's about Austin Gibbons? He was the champion of America. He was originally from England, from Liverpool, England, Austin Gibbons. He came to America and was a badass. He was going around from state to state beating top competition. You see, back in them days, they had other champions, but you had to prove first that you was the toughest in your region. You can't just overskip your region. They didn't have other sports back then. Football was new. That was a new thing back then. It hadn't even caught on yet. They didn't have all these other sports. Either you was a bad motherfucker who knew how to fight or you wasn't. There was no other sports to take the tough guys and the bad guys and put their interest in something else. So the guys who were known in each region to know how to fight, they proved that they could win in their state or whether it was overseas in the country. You had champions like these. You have the champion of England. You have the champion of fucking different states such as the champion of Virginia, all these different states. Then you have the Pacific champion, which is kind of like a step up. Now you're the Pacific champion, and then they'll have like the American champion. Like you the champion now over all of America and shit. How's about Tommy West? He fought Tommy West 4 or 5 times. That was a bad boy too. Tommy West fought black fighters too. He also fought Peter Jackson, the Baltimore Demon. But there was some corruption in one of his fights with Tommy West. Walcott was fighting him. He took a loss because he was whooping the shit out of Tommy West. And then after the 11th round, Walcott just all of a sudden sat on his stool saying that he had hurt his shoulder or something. And they automatically took his purse from him and stuff, man. They believed that he threw the fight. Anyways, Tommy West was a good fighter. He fought some of everybody. Go look at the fighters from that time period. Go look. You'll see a lot of crossing over of the different weight classes at that time period. Actually, Walcott wasn't the only welterweight or lightweight that was fighting bigger guys. There was more than him. He wasn't the only one. How's about George Gardner? Walcott, he fought George Gardner twice. One time, George Gardner won a 20-round decision, and one time Walcott won a 20-round decision. But here's the thing here. This guy Gardner, this guy here was a light heavyweight. The next year, He won the light heavyweight championship of the world the next year after he fought Walcott. Walcott beat this guy. He won the light heavyweight champion and lost it to Bob Fitzsimmons. Once again, this is another example that proves that he was fighting the same guys that Fitzsimmons and Jack Johnson then was fighting. What welterweight has done some shit like that today? There's no way this man is not at least a top 5 welterweight just based off of this shit. Hey, is it his fault that welterweights were scared? Once again, I know I sound like a broken record, but shit, man, going through this resume and doing research on the opponents and on the opponents' opponents, it's a triangle anyway because a lot of these opponents are coming back to each other. Just like that 1980s era that I did the video on. Same kind of thing. That's why I think fighters from the 80s and so, they could be compared a little bit better than these divas of today. The ones who like to sit back and say they're great and pick and choose terms. And you don't compare to these guys from this era. You couldn't have even fought in that time because your hands are way too fragile. These guys are warriors. They would have broke you up, man. They would have busted you up. You couldn't beat these light heavyweights. They weren't no cab drivers back then. This era is overlooked, man. It's overlooked because of our lack of knowledge and just being plain lazy to go out and do research. I'll bring more videos, I promise. I know I've always been saying that I'm going to bring more videos and I don't always come through with it, but I promise I'm going to bring some more of these type videos. How's about the Baltimore Demon himself? He fought him more than once. That was a bad boy. Fought him again at the end of 1901. In fact, when he fought the Baltimore Demon, the winner of that was guaranteed a title shot. He fought James Ruby Ferns, knocked him out in 5 rounds. In 1902, Walcott fought 9 times now. He fought Jimmy Handler, who defeated guys like Billy Smith. This guy, Jimmy Handler, was a middleweight to light heavyweight. He fought the 6'4" Fred Russell, a heavyweight who fought Jack Johnson. Fred Russell was trained by Jim Jeffries. He was a known dirty fighter. He's a guy who punched Jack Johnson one time in the nuts, and they had to stop the fight, man. They called a foul because the guy was just way too dirty with Jack Johnson. But the little 5'1", Walcott got in there with him, and this guy was a heavyweight. How's about Jack O'Brien? Oh, whoa. Oh, man. I did some research on this man right here. Jack O'Brien. Many have him ranked, many experts who really know this time period have him ranked as a top 5 all-time light heavyweight. I did some research on him. Hey, he's a bad boy too. Walcott fought him. The little 5'1", 140-some pound, Walcott fought him too. A guy who is considered by many experts, especially experts of this time period, to be a top 5 light heavyweight. I didn't know him, but I know who he is now, and I've been looking at some shit, and I'm going to get myself a little more familiar with some of the guys from this era. It's very interesting, man. But yeah, if he fought Jack O'Brien, who beat up guys like Bob Fitzsimmons, he fought that guy to a draw. They had a draw in their fight. 1902, he continues to fight bigger fighters all the time. How's about the Pennsylvania Terror, George Cole? He fought him 3 times. Cole is kind of known as a fighter who was a good fighter who fought everybody but didn't get a title shot. But he fought everyone. At the end of 1902, he lost to a heavyweight. He lost to Frank Childs. He was the colored heavyweight champ. The little guy, only 140-some pounds, 5'1", fought him. The colored heavyweight champ. What kind of shit is that? 1903, fought 11 times. Some of the names start to become recycled as I'm looking through his resume. But out of all the 11 fights he had, he only got credit for 1 defense because welterweights didn't want to fight him at the time. Don't get me wrong. There were some duckers back then. People was afraid of this man. They didn't want to get hurt. Fuck getting embarrassed. They didn't want to get their ass hurt. So they avoided people like Walcott. But what I didn't do enough research on is who actually were the welterweights of that time period, because during the time he was champ, all I read was that none of the other welterweights wanted to fight him. Even when he was a world champ, But some of the regional and state champions didn't want to fight him. They didn't want to fight Walcott. They didn't care about winning that championship. They didn't want to get hurt fighting Walcott. Motherfuckers knocking out heavyweights and shit. How's about John Ferguson? Ferguson beat Walcott, which right after he fought Walcott, Ferguson, he fought Jack Johnson. To me, I don't see how this guy can't be a top welterweight. He was the top welterweight of his time. And he really was the top welterweight of his time. There wasn't no cherry picking going down. It's not his fault the other fighters didn't want to fight him. They were scared shitless of him. He was the top welterweight of his time because he was fighting bigger guys that would fill in. He was still fighting 9, 10, 11 times a year. He was the welterweight champ. He was fighting. His title wasn't up on the line because the guys he was fighting was too big. So his title wasn't on the line. They couldn't make weight. They knew that he'll beat anybody who was his size. Now, you know you're a bad motherfucker when you, as the champ, is saying, shit, somebody step up. Someone fight me. He's begging fighters to fight him. I read a whole article on that, and I read other shit on that, too. I read old newspaper clippings and stuff. This man was calling out the big fighters because the guys in his weight class wouldn't fight him. So what did he do? He proved that, hey, I don't have to fight y'all. I can beat guys bigger than me. You don't see nobody running from these champions today. Ain't nobody afraid of these fighters like they was a Walcott. That motherfucker brought fear to the division. They didn't want to take a chance on getting hurt fighting Walcott. How's about Larry Temple, who fought big names? He fought Langford. Dixie Kid was a bad motherfucker. He was another small guy who fought the bigger guys all the time. Yeah, he was the one small guy that everybody said, hey, this guy here could beat Walcott because he's also beating bigger people. And these state champions and regional champions, they don't want to fight Dixie Kid. Finally gets a shot against Walcott. Walcott got disqualified in round 20 due to a foul. And they ended up finding out later that the referee made a bet on Dixie Kid. Right after he lost that fight, that same year, he fought Gans and he fought Langford. I believe it was after the Gans fight is when he had the hand injury. He was celebrating New Year's Eve, 1904, going into 1905. He shot himself in the hand. He just wasn't never the same fighter after he shot himself in the hand. At one point, they was going to amputate that hand. He continued to fight all the way till 1911. Now, after he stopped fighting in 1911, man, it didn't take long for him to be broke, man. And he had a number of jobs, man, being a janitor, cleaning up and stuff. And he was really broke, man, and going through some hard times. So they gave him a job, man. Well, I think it was around the mid-30s, okay, the 1930s. They gave him a job at Madison Square Garden cleaning up and stuff. So he's cleaning up. Now, one day, everybody come to work, and he ain't there no more, man. He just disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to Walcott. What ended up happening was a boxing fan, a passionate boxing fan like all of us, was so caught up in wanting to know what happened to Walcott that he went looking for Walcott. And in 1955, he finally found out where Walcott had went. He went over there in Ohio. Walcott ended up in the state of Ohio, a little town in Ohio called Dalton. What he had found out, he had died in 1935, 20 years earlier than when this guy finally found where he was at. And the people around the town, they knew that there was a guy around the town who said that he used to be a boxer, but nobody really knew who he was. Not in this town anyways. It's more of a football town. But there were others who knew who he was, such as Arnold Raymond Green, such as the guy who actually went looking for him. Sometimes you wonder, man, what makes somebody, go off into the darkness like that, just fade out of society kind of thing, man, and go to a small town. And here he was once a great fighter, and he was working in Madison Square Garden. He ends up going to Ohio. I don't know what took him into Ohio. I can't find no information on it. I think it's an interesting story, man, but I kind of would like to have got some more information on what happened with Walcott, why he left his job at Madison Square Garden and ended up in Ohio. I'm not sure. All I know, man, is that to me, looking at the time period that he fought in, looking at the circumstances, the situation, the fact that welterweights wouldn't fight him, and he had to fight the same guys that Bob Fitzsimmons and Jack Johnson and all these other guys was fighting from that time period. He sparred against the heavyweights of that time period. You have to understand that this guy is a top 5 welterweight, I believe. And back then, it was the toughest motherfucker. There was no cab drivers. There was none of that. Like I said, motherfuckers was lucky to have a job at the time. If they was working and their career was boxing, that was their livelihood at that time. This guy, Walcott, fought heavyweights that were well-trained with 6-ounce gloves, long rounds, extreme conditions.